Just a few miles inside the eastern border of Colorado is an exit from I-80 that's marked Julesburg. There's a little rest stop there. If you want to go into Julesburg, it's only a couple of miles across the South Platte River. I don't know why you would want to do that. There's not much there. It's just a sleepy little town. But Julesburg wasn't always sleepy, and in fact, Julesburg wasn't always just 2 miles across the Platte River. It has the reputation of having been located in 4 different places. And that's part of the story. The other part is how Julesburg got its name. You would surmise, I'm sure, that it was probably named after somebody named Jules, who was an important figure in the area, and you would be right. But if you look Jules Binney up on the internet, you won't find him under any kind of reputable heading. You'd find him under Colorado Outlaws. Jules was a French-Canadian trapper. Came to the area in the late 1850s and established a trading post to trade with the Indian tribes in the area, the Shawnee, the Arapaho, the Sioux, the Pawnee, I think. And Jules, from the very beginning, did not have a reputation of being a straight shooter. He flim-flammed the Indians every chance he got. The area, if you will remember your history, the pioneers were heading west about that time. The Oregon Trail came into being. Colonel Kearney had surveyed the area. And as the traffic picked up with the wagon trains coming through, Jules understandably started dealing with the pioneers. The stories, there are a lot of stories about that time. One of the stories is that a lot of the Indian tribes would attack the wagon trains and steal from them. And then as they pulled into Jules's trading post, Jules would sell them whatever they needed to continue the trip. There was a lot of suspicion that Jules was in cahoots with the Indian tribes to pull that off. And it fit with the character that we know about him. In 1859, after the gold rush in California, the Overland Express wanted to establish a camp, a post there in the area, and they thought the best thing to do would be to contract with Jules to be the head of the outpost, to run it. It was an isolated area, was then, is now. And Jules readily agreed. One of the problems that developed early on is that Jules would steal the cattle from the overland and then would post a reward since he was in charge, and then he would find the cattle and collect the reward. He used the hay, overland's hay, to feed his own stock. It was a good setup for Jules. And when the U.S. mail started disappearing, the people in Overland felt that he had gone too far. And so they contracted with Jack Slade, a man they had done business with before, who was a pretty rough guy himself, to come and take care of Jules and to run the outpost. Some people say that the only difference between Jack Slade and Jules Binney was that Jack was on the side of the law. A lot of stories that developed colorful characters. Well, Jack got there, knew exactly what was going on. Jules expected him, knew a little bit about Slade, and as someone said, it was hate at first sight. One of the first things that Slade did was to ride out to Jules's ranch and collect several horses that belonged to the Overland. And Jules was so mad at what was going on, and at that time Slade was unarmed. Jules pulled a revolver on him and emptied it into him. All 6 shots into Slade's body. And then, to make matters worse, ran inside the cabin, got his shotgun, and came out and emptied both barrels into him. Well, here's Slade, bleeding from every pore, collapsing. And as he collapsed, he said, "I'm not going to die." He said, "I'll be back, and I'm going to wear your ears on my watch chain." Well, the fact of the matter is, Slade didn't die. The men that were with him got him into the outpost, and he got well enough over a couple of 3 days that they could move him to the hospital in St. Louis. And he was there for quite a while, and they got most of the slugs out of him when they dismissed him. When he was well enough to ride again, he still had 8 slugs in him, and he headed back for Julesburg. He had a job to do. Well, the other part of the story is that when Jules shot Slade, it was that very afternoon that the stagecoach was coming through, and the superintendent of Overland was on the stagecoach. Found out what was happening, and he had a scaffold erected and proceeded to hang Jules. Well, Jules didn't die right away. He put a noose around Benny's neck, hoisted him up, and of course, every time he'd hoist him up, and Benny would plead for his life and vow to change his ways, let him back down, pull him up a second time, let him back down, pull him up the third time, and the superintendent said, "Jules, if you'll vow that you will never set foot in Julesburg again, I'll let you go." Jules agreed, and he left town. When Slade got back, Jules was gone. He wasn't gone terribly far, but and he got word that Slade was back in town, and the hatred between the two of them was so intense. Jules said he was going to go back to Julesburg, going to collect some of the cattle that he left when he left in such a hurry. And he was going to kill Jack Slade once and for all. But Jack got wind of that. He wasn't going to sit around and wait for Jules to show up, so he proceeded to get 3 or 4 of his men together, and they rode over to Cold Spring, where Jules was living, located him, captured him, tied him up to a fence post, and proceeded to kill him. The story varies a little bit at that point as to exactly what happened there, but the fact of the matter is, Jack Slade took his gun and literally beat Jules to death. And then you know what he did, of course. He cut off his ears. The story is that he put one of them on his watch fob, and the other one he put some gravel in the ear and pulled the skin over it until it healed, and used it as a rattle. I hate to know that my kids ever had to play with a rattle like that. Jack continued to stay there and to run the outpost, and the Overland was pretty well pleased with him. Now that's part of the story. The other part is the town that moved. A fort had been established by this time, and on one occasion the 2 of the tribes, I think it was the Pawnee and the Sioux, or Shawnee, got together and burned Julesburg. Now, the population of Julesburg at that time was about 2,000 people. And the story is that there were about 126 saloons, too many brothels to count, and several gambling establishment. Eastern writers who knew about Julesburg called it the wickedest city in the plains. Mark Twain spent an hour there on a route, and he met Jack Slade, and he had kinder things to say about Julesburg. And incidentally, Julesburg is only a few miles away from Ogallala, Nebraska now, and Ogallala is where 3 different routes, trails met, and it had a reputation for being a town too tough for Texans. People love those stories of the past. But when the town burned, the people in Julesburg moved over. They took refuge at the fort at first, and then after the battle was over, they decided to establish town right by the fort. It made sense because they'd have protection, and they also found a very lucrative trade, trading liquor to the soldiers. Then the overland, the Union Pacific Railroad came through, and they established a post back on the north side of the river. And when they did that, everybody, the Julesburg town, just moved back over there. When they got there, they tried to change the name to Denver Junction or something like that, but people wouldn't have it. It was Julesburg. It always has been. It always would be. So the town was now in its 3rd location. And then as the railroad developed, they created a spur that went off to the north, and which was 4 or 5 miles away, and the town moved there and called itself Denver Junction for a while, and then finally reverted back to Julesburg. The town itself moved 3 different times, was in 4 different locations. Today, Julesburg is a quiet little town of about 2,000. When my wife and I visited there not too long ago, we found Sarah running the museum at the what used to be a depot, and she told us a lot of these stories. We drove around town and saw a bank, several small stores, a couple of churches, and a huge farm implement, tractor, and automobile dealership. And I suspect that's about all that's going on in that area. But as I say, take the Julesburg exit if you're ever by that way. And if you've got a little extra time, cross the river a couple of miles. Sarah will probably still be at the museum, and talk to her for a while and pick up some of the stories of the Old West. Julesburg, Colorado. There's never been anybody like old Jules. Thank goodness.